Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan and to today's event. I'm Anthony Rowley, current director and former president of the club, and it's my pleasure to act as moderator today. This is the latest of what we call our deep dive series, in which we ask panels of experts to discuss topics of current interest. And I think today's topic is of current and future interest too. It's a very important topic, I think. It's based on a newly published report which suggests that which is entitled Asia at a Crossroads, and which poses the question, how can Japan ensure regional peace and prosperity? And today with us to discuss it are our three guests. So let me introduce them right away in the order in which they'll be speaking. In the center, well, not immediately to my right, but to my next right, is Yoshihide. No, sorry, I beg your pardon, that's wrong. Sorry, to my immediate right. You'll have to excuse me, I had a rush to the club this morning. Okay, so we have Yoshihide Soya, who's Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Law at Keio University. And to his right is Mike Mochizuki, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. And to my extreme right, on the end of the table, last but by no means least, is Kuniko Ashizawa, who is an adjunct professorial lecturer at the School of International Service at the American University. Okay, so that's our speakers. I'll say a little bit more about their backgrounds before they speak. In this report today, they question Japan's national security strategy, which was adopted last December, whether it's adequate to navigate the challenges facing Asia at the present time as the United States and China strategic competition intensifies and as the shape of the international order becomes increasingly uncertain. Or does Japan need to refashion its diplomatic and security strategy in order to help create stability and prosperity in the region? The full title of the document is Asia's Future at a Crossroads, a Japanese Strategy for Peace and Sustainable Prosperity. It was released just yesterday, and it offers, the authors say, a more realistic alternative approach for Japan than the one which the government has recently adopted. The report marks the culmination of more than 4 years of study and debate among 11 prominent scholars and former practitioners of Japanese foreign policy and international relations. It argues that Japan should pursue more proactive middle power diplomacy to mitigate the US-China rivalry and to avoid a sharp division in Asia and to prevent great power conflict. So we'll start with Professor Soya, as I said. He is a Professor Emeritus at Keio University, from which he retired in March 2020 after serving as Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the Faculty of Law for 32 years since 1988. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1987, specializing in world politics. His areas of interest are international relations in East Asia and Japanese diplomacy and its external relations. So before we start, let me just remind you that if you have a mobile phone, please put it onto manner mode or switch it off as a courtesy to our speakers. So, Professor Soya.
Yes, sorry, I didn't do that. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your kind introduction, not only of ourselves, but of the project itself. Our sort of sense of concern, or if I may, mission, has to do with what we believe to be somewhat fundamental drawbacks of the current national security strategy, which was approved by the cabinet in November last year. And let me start from there, and then I will essentially talk about sort of middle power framework as an alternative to the current sort of paradigm, or if you will, of the government security strategy. And the national security strategy starts by saying that Japan faces the most severe and complex security environment since the end of the World War II. Well, we don't question if that's right or wrong, but I think that assessment may not be entirely off the mark, even for ourselves. But what stands out in this security document is the emphasis on power politics, including military dimension of interstate relations, and geopolitics and economic security. And well, in retrospect, Japan's post-war security policy, I would argue, until around 2012, did not embrace such an explicit geopolitical orientation. And on the contrary, post-war Japanese security policy consciously, according to a phrase by one prominent IR specialist, some time ago, of course, he was active, Japan virtually stepped out of the stage of power politics, post-war Japan. And Japan limited its defense capability to that sort of small scale and limited, targeting small scale and limited acts of aggression. And it's Japan's so-called 基盤的防衛力, basic defense force, did not sort of target so-called objective security threats existing outside of Japan. And because that was beyond Japan's capacity anyway. And the shoyo防衛力, required defense force concept was again intentionally rejected in the Japanese defense planning. But the current security document made a 180-degree turnaround from this post-war so-called paradigm of Japanese security policy. So this raises a fundamental question. To what extent is Japan really able to cope with this new geopolitical situation on its own? And the answer should be obvious. Does anyone believe that Japan's national power now is greater than before in either relative or absolute terms? So we must conclude that there exists a significant disparity between the paradigm that presented in the National Security Strategy document and Japan's own capabilities. So accordingly, the US-Japan alliance is deemed essential to fill this gap. And in that sense, maybe alone, there is an element of logical consistency in Japan's new security strategy. So therefore, strengthening the US-Japan alliance ends up being the strategy's almost a priori premise, and it's absolutely indispensable prescription. And in short, under the current security paradigm, Japan is stuck with the US. And the document even says explicitly that Japan's strategy and that of the US should be integral. And our concern arises from this framework in which Asia may be entangled and could be divided if the current sort of bipolar assessment of the international politics is going to continue for many years to come. And the last thing many Asian countries want is to pushed into the corner whereby they have to make an ultimate choice between the US and China. And so that's a concern about the current framework and its implications for Asia and Japan's strategy, including, of course, strategy toward Asia. Then an alternative middle power approach is going to be as follows. This is a sort of strategic concept. And if you have this alternative concept, security landscape, how you interpret and see security landscape would be very different. I think that's the power of concept. And so middle power is being presented as a conceptual sort of framework rather than anything else, whether Japan is middle or great or anything of that sort. And as part, and one proposal which we make in this context is Japan will be able to build upon even the Quad, the quadrilateral framework of dialogue and the cooperation among Japan, US, Australia, and India. And according to the sort of the current existing dominant framework, Quad may be perceived as US-Japan alliance plus Australia and India. But if you take this middle power approach, Quad can be viewed as Japan, Australia, India plus US, which would mean Japan, Australia, India should lead the agenda setting of this Quad and input our sort of views and assessment into this framework, whereby US, of course, is going to play an important role. But the role of the US under this framework, even though US is important, should be different from the role of the US if seen from the current existing government framework. And if Quad is to be reconceptualized that way, then inviting Korea would begin to make a lot of sense. If this is US-Japan plus Australia, India, Korea may hesitate. But if it is Japan, Australia, India plus US, what Korea should join or can join mostly is this trilateral framework of middle powers. And we are proposing that as one way of looking at this sort of new framework. And this notion can be then extended to include other middle powers. And this could make a sort of regional infrastructure of cooperation and prosperity among the regional countries. So this is sort of an autonomous sort of a strategy on the part of agents. We cannot have that independently. Cooperation, multilateral cooperation should be the mechanism anyway, in one way or another. And I think that's what middle power cooperation essentially talks about. And so in that sense, I think for Japan, the most important, so this aspect of middle power cooperation as an alternative is our recommendation number 1 in this proposal. And recommendation number 2 has to do with Korea. We would think the most important partner for Japan's middle power diplomacy is indeed the Republic of Korea. ROK is an established democracy and a developed economy. It has become one of the 10 largest economies in the world, and its per capita income matches or even exceeds that of Japan. So of course we do recommend that our government reciprocate President Yoon Suk-yeol's very courageous actions in one way or another, and continue to improve the Japan-South Korea relations. If Japan-South Korea relation becomes totally different in this broader context, I think it will make a sea change in sort of multilateral sort of cooperation in the region. And of course, we know that's not a reality. So therefore, it is important to try to make it real. And anybody will think about the question whether, to what extent do you think this is going to be realistic? This framework itself and many of the recommendations. The current security discourse and even government strategy is a creation of, I think, some mindset rather than necessarily based on realistic, honest observation of actual situations. Many of them are stuck with some sort of idealism of assault. So we believe what we discuss here are more realistic than what they tend to think. So in that sense, it is realistic. But human beings are not created that way necessarily, and of course, including Japan-South Korea relations. So I will finish here and move on to Mike. Yeah. How long did I talk? I made it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, next is Mike. You don't mind me calling you Mike Mochizuki, I hope, just who holds the Japan-U.S. Relations Chair in memory of Gaston Sigor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He received his PhD in political science from Harvard University. He specializes in East Asian international relations and Japanese politics and foreign relations. So, Professor Mochizuki, please.
Well, first I want to thank Mr. Rowley and the FCCJ for hosting this deep dive event, and for all of you to come so early in the morning to hear from us. So I want to pick up from where Professor Soya ended, and first state that when we started this project, it was back in December 2018, and that was 4 years before the release of the new national security strategy. So when we put together this project, it wasn't that we were trying to critique the new national security strategy. One of the key motivations of this project was that when we looked and we assessed what were the really existential threats to humanity, it was climate change and the effects, the devastating effects that we are already beginning to see in Asia and worldwide. And the threat, the challenge of climate change, in our view, required an unprecedented, a historically unprecedented level of international cooperation. But yet, when we were looking at Japanese foreign policy discourse and American foreign policy discourse, there was a preoccupation, I would say an obsession with this notion of great power competition. And with the arrival of the Biden administration, there was a focus on this competition, the struggle between democracies and authoritarianism. And certainly that is one aspect of international politics. But we felt that in order to deal with the true existential threat of climate change, we needed to overcome great power competition and promote interstate cooperation. So that was our initial mindset. And then we saw the national security strategy. And as Professor Soya indicated, that the logical conclusion and as well as the premise of the new national security strategy is to tighten the security relationship with the United States and to basically have Japan be a vigorous partner in the US-led strategy in East Asia. Now, one might say that this might make sense if the US strategy was the correct strategy. But in our view, I think the US strategy tends to be an overreaction to an inflation of the Chinese threat. And so if the Japanese were to blindly follow and support and be the cheerleader of this misguided US strategy, then the effect would be a tragedy for all of Asia, and especially for Japan, which is now a frontline state in this US-China strategic competition. Now, there are some indications from the Biden administration that they're trying to stabilize the relationship with China, and I wish them well. but I am not particularly confident that the Biden administration has the political clout nor the strategic vision to stabilize the relationship with China. And so I think it's imperative on Japan, as Professor Soya says, being a leader of a middle power coalition to provide some constraints, some restraints on this U.S.-China competition. Another kind of criticism that we will surely get from our report is that, well, this might make sense, but doesn't Japan need to actually follow the United States? Because if the Japanese did not follow the American lead, won't the United States then abandon Japan? And this kind of insecurity about the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think, is endemic to the mindset of many of the policy leaders and politicians in Japan. But one of the things that is clear to me is that with the rapid change in the balance of power, with the rise of China and the relative decline of the United States in East Asia, that the United States needs Japan's proactive support and cooperation more than ever before. So there's really no possibility that the United States is going to abandon Japan. The United States wants Japan in its corner. And therefore, Japan has leverage to speak its mind, to be more like a France or a Germany, to say that we share fundamental interests, but maybe the United States is overreacting and is pursuing a dangerous path. And so that's one of the fundamental approaches in our report, is that it is time for Japan to value the relationship with the United States as before, but to be a little bit more autonomous and to speak its mind when the United States is going off course. Now, in the remainder of my time, let me just touch on some of the key recommendations regarding security policy, and these are all very complicated issues, so I can only highlight our conclusions, but in the Q&A, we would be happy to explain those policies in more detail. One has to do with Japanese defense policy, and we do support Japan building up its defense capabilities. We think a lot of the things that Japan is doing to enhance the mobility of Japanese self-defense forces makes a lot of sense. But in our report, we are clearly opposed to what some Japanese politicians call a counter-strike capability to attack enemy bases. Now, that's been kind of toned down to just counter-strike capabilities, but it's clear that the promoters of these counter-strike capabilities think that Japan's security will be enhanced by having the capability to strike enemy targets on the mainland of China, and including missile bases, air bases, and the like. Now, a lot of this just doesn't make sense to us when the Japanese government is procuring Tomahawk missiles, which go at the speed of a little bit more than a regular jet, going after Chinese missiles that are mobile. And so the possibility of these Tomahawks actually degrading Chinese missile capabilities is just nonsensical. And then the other thing that's fundamentally missing in the Japanese government's policies is the notion of how would China react to this kind of counter attack. And China geographically is expansive. They've got missile sites and air bases dispersed throughout Chinese territory, and they've got a very robust arsenal of missiles. And so just by having this counterattack, one has to imagine how then the Chinese would react. And in the end, such an attack is likely to spiral into escalation and even possibly to the nuclear level. So we think that this is a terrible use of resources. It has negative side effects, and it's only marginally contributes to deterrence. We are, however, in support of standoff missile capabilities, which the Japanese can use as missiles launched from the air or the sea at the outer edges of China's so-called anti-access aerial denial zone to interdict Chinese aggression. But this would be not to attack the mainland of China. A second policy recommendation deals with North Korea. I mean, we think, of course, that as a long-term goal, Japan, with the United States and South Korea, should have the goal of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. But anyone looking at the record over the last few decades know that that goal has become much more difficult to achieve, in large part because of many diplomatic errors that the United States has made. And so what we recommend is that Japan, working especially with South Korea, move towards achieving a verifiable freeze of North Korean missile and nuclear programs. And even President Yoon, who is a conservative, has talked about an audacious approach towards North Korea to have dialogue with North Korea without preconditions. And so as part of this middle power coalition that Professor Soya mentioned, Japan and South Korea should really spearhead an effort to achieve a verifiable freeze and an incremental step-by-step approach to denuclearization. And in the context of this, there would be a full normalization of relations between Japan and North Korea, as well as moving towards a peace system on the Korean Peninsula. Another issue, a third issue that we do some analysis on is the Taiwan issue, and we see this as one of the most serious concerns, security concerns in East Asia. Unfortunately, both the United States and Japan are pursuing a policy that focuses primarily on deterrence, and we see that a deterrence-only policy is most likely to aggravate the Taiwan issue. There is no amount of deterrence that will compel China to change its primary motivation of wanting to unify Taiwan with China. But what Japan and South Korea and other countries can do is to try to shape China's intentions so that it will be much more patient about unification and that it will still count on a peaceful approach. And deterrence, just focusing on deterrence without reassurance, is unlikely to achieve that goal. And so as a minimal requirement of reassurance, we believe that Japan should explicitly state that it does not support the independence of Taiwan. Even the United States has stated that in writing in its national security strategy. But for some reason, the Japanese government has been shy about explicitly stating that it does not support the independence of Taiwan. Fourth issue, on the Senkaku Island issue, I mean, we believe that that is one of the key issues that have destabilized Sino-Japanese relations. We feel that the way to stabilize this bilateral relationship is to recognize that there is indeed an issue between Japan and China regarding the Senkaku Islands. This is a point that was recognized in the November 2014 statement of understanding between Japan and China, and to build on that, to have a serious dialogue with China about how to reduce tensions regarding the Senkakus, and our report suggests some ideas for that. And in addition to that, Japan and China should begin to negotiate to implement the June 2008 understanding to turn the East China Sea into a sea of friendship, peace, and cooperation. And even to this day, China, along with Japan, sees that the negotiations of June 2008 are still valid. Now, finally, since I'm almost out of time, we do make some recommendations regarding Japan's nuclear policy. We find the current trends in nuclear armaments to be very worrisome, not simply because China is building up its nuclear arsenal, but also the role that U.S. nuclear strategy is playing in kind of provoking China to develop its nuclear arsenal. And one of the reasons for this is that the United States, through its new triad concept, is trying to maintain strategic primacy vis-a-vis other adversarial nuclear powers like Russia and China. And one of the reasons for this is because the United States feels that it needs to have robust extended nuclear deterrence for its allies. We feel that one way of stopping this trend or to slowing down this trend is for Japan to urge the nuclear weapon states to adopt a no first use policy regarding nuclear weapons. We feel, we agree with former Secretary of Defense William Perry, that nuclear threats against non-nuclear threats or conventional threats are not credible. And in fact, it impedes progress towards nuclear arms control. Also, as a supplement to this, we favor Japan being an observer of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. And we believe that Japan, given its tragic history over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, can play a bridging role between the nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states by participating as an observer in the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I felt a cool breeze blow through this room a short time ago. It wasn't the air conditioning, it was what I personally think is the sense of realism which characterizes your presentation so far. Okay, let's turn to Professor Kuniko Ashizawa, who teaches international relations at the School of International Service at the American University and also at the Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. Her research interests include Japan's foreign policy, regional institution building in Asia, and global governance. She received her PhD in international relations at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So, Professor Ashizawa, please.
Thank you. So Professor Soe and Professor Mochizuki are the co-conveners of this study group, and then I'm just one of the member of this study group. But I just wanted to make, I'm going to just share what we discussed about our view and then also proceeding recommendation in the area of regional economics and then also transnational challenge issues. But before going to that, I just want to highlight some importance of our study group. The fact I'm sitting here is, I think, that one unique characters of this study group, because usually in this kind of the study on Japanese national security or foreign policy, there are not many women are in the discussions. But our conveners consciously kind of thought about this gender balance in a way to bring more kind of comprehensive views, and then in a way kind of beyond the box thinking in our discussion. So it's not just me, but also 3 members are female. In addition to this gender balance, we also have a specialist on Southeast Asian countries, Russia, and then also 1 European specialist. So this is another way we wanted to have this discussion more substantive and then hopefully kind of broad and meaningful. So that's one important character of this report. And then also, as I said, I'm going to talk about regional economics and then also transnational agendas. And then if you just check this, the context, the order of this report, you see the chapter 2 indeed focusing on the regional economics. And so that kind of precedes the regional security. Again, this type of proposal and then policy recommendation, usually the regional security or national security matters comes first. But this is our conscious kind of choice to put regional economics issues before the regional security. And then one of the reasons we kind of decided to do is, of course, as Professor Soea and also Professor Mochizuki kind of highlight to our underlying approach, this idea is that the concept of Japanese middle power diplomacy, and then also valuing U.S.-Japan alliance simultaneously to pursue more autonomous foreign policy. And then in the area of regional economics and then transnational challenge arena, we thought that this is a more space that maybe Japan can come up to a little bit more concrete the measures and then policies to realize this our approach, which is middle power diplomacy, and then more pro-American but autonomous foreign policy. So I would like to a little bit talk about the more key recommendations in economic arenas, and then one for the transnational challenge, and then to kind of show how, indeed, that this area would help us to Japan to come up a little bit more kind of visible and then concrete policy agendas to pursue our ideas. In terms of regional economics arena, because this is a group of the scholars, so we definitely discuss about a little bit more like a conceptual, the idea and then also principles of the Japanese regional economic foreign policies, and then so and then also reflecting that the ongoing discussion, the policy discussions in regional economic matters. So one kind of underlying the recommendation is that Japan should strike balance between among the 3 kind of agendas. 1, still promoting economic liberalization. 2nd, we need to more pay attention to the issue of sustainable development agenda, which indeed reflect that some of the kind of negative impact arising from the economic liberalization or globalization. And many kind of people, the nations and then the populations in the regions do kind of have been suffering from that kind of the economic liberalization related some negative impact, particularly in the environmental arenas, and then also the growing kind of economic the income parity, and then other kind of socio-economic the impact. And then the thirdly, kind of economic security agenda also need to be definitely kind of incorporated in the Japanese regional economic diplomacy. So we kind of agree that we need to take balance between the economic liberalization, sustainable development agenda, and then also economic security agenda. In particular, the Japanese government put forth that the new economic security promotion law last year. So we wanted to kind of reflect that the new Japanese law into our discussions. And in addition to this kind of striking balance between these 2 agendas, also we kind of agreed to keep the Japanese kind of approach to the regional economic cooperation, which often requires creating new grouping among Asian countries to handle, to address some of the challenge in economic arenas. And so the economic matters often kind of is associated with creating new grouping, new kind of regional institution, regional grouping within the member of the Asia. And then for that, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit technical kind of terminology, but for this particular issues, we wanted to kind of recommend Japan to keep the principle of open regionalism. Which means we really wanted Japan to use this kind of regional economy, the diplomacy in a way to discourage the growing new division within Asia, or so-called like a bipolarization of region. And they're using those new economic, the mechanism, the cooperative mechanism, in a way to ensure that to bring the key regional countries in a way together and then to keep our discussions. So still it's a little bit kind of a conceptual issue. So what is the concrete recommendations we came up with? So I want to highlight two recommendations from regional economic arenas, which might be of your interest and can be a little bit controversial from those specialists. Then first recommendation is recommendation 4. We discussed about the regional kind of trade agreement, particularly free trade agreement, how to promote the further regional free trade kind of the mechanism within Asia. And then, as probably you came across the latest news about this regional free trade agreement, which is CPTPP, the comprehensive and progressive agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was established by the 11 members. But I think last week, the United Kingdom joined the new member of the CPTPP. So after the UK joined the CPTPP, what's the issue? It's a China and then Taiwan question, because both of the economy, Taiwan and China, put forth their membership application to CPTPP. We discussed a lot of kind of this question: what Japan should indeed kind of say what kind of the Japanese approach should be. And our recommendation, our idea is that Japan should kind of pursue the foreign policy kind of discourse and then some action in a way to encourage China and Taiwan simultaneously join CPTPP. We did have lots of kind of discussion in this the report how to explain why we came up with this idea, but obviously one of we did look at the pro and con of Chinese participation, and then also difficulty associated with the Chinese kind of admission of CPTPP. But we also kind of kind of recognize the value of the China joining CPTPP in a way that the process of the negotiation, we can get more information about Chinese economic policy. And then also we understand from our Chinese specialists, there's a voice within China to, in a way, to change Chinese domestic economic policy, or to implement more kind of major reform of the Chinese economic policy in line with their kind of China's joining CPTPP. And we would like to encourage that part of Chinese kind of economic reform, because that would benefit both not just China, but the Asian countries' economy, including Japanese business sectors. And then thirdly, we see that if the China and Taiwan would join CPTPP, this would give the very unique, one of the few kind of official venues that the Chinese and also Taiwanese kind of the policymakers would formally participate. And that also associated with our one idea to make the East Asian kind of international relations a little bit more stable and then in a way conducive to more discussion and then cooperation. So because of that, we decided to kind of this the recommendation. And then why we said simultaneously, probably you understand the reality, but if Taiwan joined first, then China would not join. If China joined first, then it's going to be really difficult even to imagine China would agree for the Taiwan's accession. So the most likely way to do it is the simultaneous admission, and which was indeed practiced already by the WTO admission and then also APEC admission. So this is one the recommendation we made. The second recommendation we made in the economic arenas that I wanted to highlight is a digital economy rule making. So this is a little bit associated with the more economic security arena, and then the how indeed to introduce more kind of the proper rules and then agreement among the states to deal with digital economy in terms of data sharing and then also data transfer, etc., has been discussed in many different forums. And then actually, this is a quite messy process we have observed. But within Asia, the US appears to be trying to take lead in this discussion by introducing that new framework, Indo-Pacific economic framework, which President Biden launched. And then, of course, Japan did support this the IPEF framework, and it did lots of heavy lifting to convince some other Southeast Asian countries to join this IPEF framework, and which would discuss economic security arena. I mean, see that, for instance, the supply chain, but that also would include digital economy rule making. So our kind of recommendation is still, we value this kind of US-led IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework kind of initiative. But simultaneously, we wanted Japanese government to look at the little bit less well-known the framework on this digital economy, which probably is not well covered in Japanese media or in American media too. There's a new framework called the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which was launched by Singapore, Chile, and then New Zealand. So very interesting small countries initiatives. That kind of reminds us the creation of TPP, original TPP. And then this arrangement was introduced in 2020. After these three countries agreed to this new rules on digital economy, the South Korea joined a few weeks ago to this deep digital economic partnership agreement. And then now China and then Canada are indeed put forth their accession. They put forth their proposal to join deeper. So digital economic partnership agreement. So this may kind of see the possibility to expand a little bit more the kind of Asian-led new the mechanism to discuss and then come up to new rules and standard for dealing with digital economy, kind of new challenge. So we proposed the Japanese government also to look at this new framework, the deeper, and then indeed to seriously consider the possible the Japanese application to join the deeper. Okay. So that's the two kind of the recommendation. Lastly, the transnational challenge. I will be very short, but when we look at the transnational challenge arena, which is like a climate change, global health, and then also human rights or humanitarian issues. We actually appreciate the Japanese government have been indeed doing some the positive the role, particularly through the United Nations or multilateral organization at the global level. But in the meantime, as Professor Mochizuki pointed out, also as we kind of expressed in our reading in the report, there's over the past few years, there is a kind of sense, the trend, the Japanese government appears to be like looking away from this particular area through this international organization or multilateral regional organization to do a little bit more contribution to make Japan to be more like a leading middle power. So we wanted to kind of remind the Japanese government or policymakers that we need to also they need to pay attention to this transnational challenge. And then also, this is an area that maybe Japan should also do some creative cooperation with China. And so the recommendation, among the 15 recommendation is that the overall recommendation is that we kind of suggested Japan also, and this is a kind of area of the climate change challenge. We recommended Japan should indeed probably pursue the more kind of technical cooperation with China when it comes to that the more renewable kind of energy technological development. And so, and then also we recommend the Japanese government to come up to cooperate with the Chinese government in not just bilaterally, but also these two bilateral cooperation would take place in third countries, like primarily Southeast Asian countries, to enable or help those the relatively developing countries to develop that again some new the environmental technologies and then kind of the mechanism to reduce the carbon kind of emission to in a way to contribute the overall this climate challenge. So those are the kind of three policy recommendations I wanted to highlight. And then of course there may be lots of questions about the feasibility and also the rationale of this question. And then I'll be happy to answer during the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ashizawa. Before I open the floor, perhaps I could just ask a very brief question, which is, what kind of meetings have you been having here in Japan at government level and other level, which will help to promote your ideas? And also, what's the next step as far as you're concerned? You published this report, so where do you go from here in terms of trying to get further action, further contact in the international community? Professor Mochizuki, perhaps.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that question. So we released the report officially yesterday at a Japan National Press Club conference, and then this is our second meeting, and so we will be holding another meeting tonight at Temple University, Japan, where we hope there will be people from the policy community attending. We will be traveling to Osaka to meet with business leaders in the Kansai region. We plan to set up one-on meetings with selected politicians to talk about this and meet with the think tank community in Tokyo. And later this summer, we'll have some rollout events in Washington, D.C. So this is just the beginning. We think that this report has a longer shelf life, and these issues will become increasingly salient as time goes on. So we're going to be quite methodical in approaching politicians and members of the government. But one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that this report got publicized, and so we really wanted to target the mass media journalists so that you can help us kind of have at least, even if you don't agree with us, to have a much more open debate about these issues. I mean, we just feel that there's now kind of a tyranny of consensus, both in Japan and the United States, and alternative views are not articulated nor publicized. So that's one of the first things we wanted to do.
I see. But you've not had any specific meetings at ministerial level in...
Not at this point yet.
Not at this point in time.
Yeah.
And does the same apply in the United States? Or, what level of access do you have in the US? Because these are terribly important ideas. And,
yes, well, I mean, we all have our networks of people in government and out of government. I've sent this report to many of my good friends who have been at the highest levels of the the U.S. government.
Thank you. Okay, let's take questions from the floor. Sorry, will you introduce yourself? Those are at the microphone. And
Hello, Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. I thought Ashida-san's point about the CPTPP was very interesting, in that you said the membership of Taiwan and China should be simultaneous. I appreciate the clarity in the position, but I kind of think it really symbolizes the whole topic of this report, whether the criteria of cooperation should be rules-based or the priority should be not to antagonize China. When it comes to the CPTPP, if it really is based on whether you tick the boxes and you abide by the rules, if Taiwan is ready, what logical reason is there to make Taiwan wait until China joins? Meaning, the true goal, are you saying, is to make sure that there's a framework that China joins, not necessarily because Taiwan meets the rules. And to Professor Mochizuki and Soya-san, I think the Japanese government's current position is to defend the existing international order, which is rules-based, transparent, and predictable and democratic, and that it should not allow the emergence of a new order, which China is proposing, because such a new order would not be comfortable for Japan. You said that one of the starting points of your discussions is the necessity to discuss transnational issues like climate change. I think the current Japanese government's answer to that would be, well, as long as China is not willing to play in the existing ring, so to say, China would naturally condition cooperation on climate change on concessions on other issues like Taiwan. So my question is, can Japan live in such a China-led new regional order? And to Soya-san, the middle power diplomacy and pushing for a more autonomous diplomacy like France, you said, was very symbolic, I thought. Doesn't that kind of accelerate the switch from a US-led order to a China-led world? And in that sense, do you, like President Macron, oppose a NATO office in Tokyo, for instance? Thank you.
right, Professor Mochizuki-san, do you want to go first? Oh, sorry, Ashida-san, yes,
I'll
please.
go quickly. Thank you for the question. And then, I expected this question. Yeah, we really discussed about the proposal, and even among our members, there's a serious concern about feasibility, and then also that the harm that may cause Taiwan, because Taiwan is already kind of economically ready, and Japan has a position with Taiwan's Japanese relationship. There's no way that Japan should oppose Taiwanese admission. However, if you set this kind of rule-based the mechanism of CPTPP, the admission itself should be indeed, it's going to make through the kind of unanimous agreement among the members. And then our members of the Southeast Asian specialists in particular, they shared, indeed, there are kind of growing views among Southeast Asian countries, some of them of whom also kind of in a way oppose Taiwanese unilateral admission first, because they want to have China also be part of CPTPP. So even I think the Japanese media and American media tend to kind of encourage, suggest that Taiwan should be first. But reality, it's not actually easy to have Taiwanese just joining first in CPTPP. It should be the consensus decision making among all the members of CPTPP. So include that kind of consideration for CPTPP's new admission. We thought maybe it's at this point the stage of discussion, probably it kind of makes sense to kind of highlight that this possibility of the simultaneous admission of China and Taiwan, and then to kind of discuss with some other countries within CPTPP members who share similar ideas, and then promote this idea. But we kind of really make sure in the recommendation that that condition for China to join, the China definitely should indeed go kind of align with that what UK did. So the current CPTPP standards should be maintained. And then also through the negotiation, we kind of make sure that either side, Taiwan or China, should not take kind of see the obstruction action vis-a-vis the other countries. And so that's kind of one important condition that we're going to pursue this potential simultaneous admission. And of course, we need to see, it's going to be not quick solutions. So we need to see how Taiwan and also China would respond as we move on. And there's a really kind of further serious obstacle maybe from Beijing's side vis-a-vis Taiwanese admission. And then, of course, the Japanese government or other like-minded countries also need to kind of review this idea and then to come up maybe other kind of alternative ideas to that admission issues.
Does that answer all your question? Or much as extent, please.
Well, let me just add on to what Dr. Ashizawa said. I know that in Japan there are many politicians that say, well, since Taiwan is ready, let's submit Taiwan first. Well, we think that that's an unrealistic stance because it's not clear that there will be unanimous support from all CPTPP members to bring Taiwan in first. I mean, there's a lack of realism in that. And secondly, we feel that the exercise of negotiations to get China to meet the high standards of CPTPP serves two positive purposes. One, we learn more about the Chinese economy. It enhances transparency. Secondly, it provides an incentive for China to reform its economy. So it's seen as a positive tool. And so this is why, although it's imperfect, this is the way of encouraging China to move in the right direction. And then this gets into the premise of your question about this rules-based order. And we have a pretty short discussion of this rules-based order in the report. And we basically question the dominant discourse, which your question reflects, is that there is this rules-based order that's US-led, and China is coming up with a different set of rules that is overturning this US-led rules-based order. We recognize the importance of rules, but this is a work in progress. At the beginning of the post-war period, certainly the United States played a key role in developing some of the very important international institutions that we live with today, from the United Nations to GATT to the IMF. But if you look at the rest of the history of the development of rules, it is a very pluralistic process. Some of it is from major power initiatives, but a lot of it is from smaller countries, and is based on negotiation and compromises. And so, although it's important to remember the rules, we should not be over-religious and restrictive to the sense that we exacerbate conflicts. And that's the fundamental problem with the current discourse, is that there's this assumption that there is this US-led order and China is trying to overturn it. And look at US foreign policy over the last 50 years. There's many times where the United States has bent the rules and has even violated the rules. no one is clean in terms of following the rules. And so this is where we need to be a little bit more flexible and bring diplomacy into this. And if you're too legalistic and formalistic, it kind of exacerbates the problem. And this very notion that, well, China, we can't work with them in the environment because they're playing in a different ring, that is just the kind of mindset that we want to fight against, because if you take that view, then we are never going to address the urgent issues of climate change. International politics is about compromise, and we're much more interested in getting positive results rather than say, oh, well, our rules won versus the rules of another country.
Yes, if I may, also my quick comments on the 3 points. One, I think they have already clarified this. I mean, Taiwan joining CPTPP alone is not going to happen because some of the members of CPTPP are hesitant. So it's not going to be realized in reality. And if China joins first, Taiwan will never. So almost by default, I think joint membership is the logical and realistic option. I think we should think about this more in those terms. And second, about rule-based order versus new order by China. I don't think there is a new order being created by the Chinese leadership. I can't think of any particular country, who would be happy about China-centered, either regional or global order. And here, of course, there is a question of the global south. And if there are, areas or cases whereby global south countries may appear to be supporting sort of Chinese attempt to resist America-led order, I think they are doing this essentially because of their immediate national interest, rather than their interest in supporting China creating its own, order. And some of those interests are sometimes very parochial, and in some cases China has an advantage, yes, but I don't think that is the case of, China succeeding in creating its new order necessarily. And so our attempt is, of course, to bring China into the area of rule-based sort of, practices and behaviors as much as possible. I think this traditionally this has been called as an engagement, and now dominant perception is engagement has failed. And looking at Xi Jinping's propensity in several dimensions.
Hi.
What is it?
Someone's agreeing with you.
Someone agreed.
Yes, we all.
Right. Somebody behind. Well, environment is not necessarily, favorable to say this, but I think it's a bit too early to give up that attempt. It's a long-term process. And engagement may have failed, but flip side is deterrence, but there is no guarantee that deterrence is going to work either, right? So we have to continue to experiment. And lastly, middle power diplomacy may be somewhat giving into the Chinese initiative. Of course, I don't think so, because even Southeast Asian countries, many of them are not happy about China. But they don't believe they have an option of confronting China. They are afraid of China, traditionally, historically, as well as under the current circumstances. So therefore, I mean, multilateral cooperation among regional countries is a way how they will think about their China strategy. And one, I think we shouldn't forget that one critical sort of element of this multilateral attempt by middle powers has to do with the United States. It's not necessarily neutral 100% between China and the US. Conceptually, you can make an argument this is a neutral thing, but in reality, I think many of us are much closer to the US than to China. So therefore, US as an anchor will continue to remain an important premise of this middle power multilateralism. And the point is, we have to discuss how and why US is important for us. And we have to make efforts to build regional consensus as to the role of the US. And European countries have been doing this for a long time, and there remain some differences, of course, among countries, like France. But France was against, NATO headquarters in Japan, not necessarily because they are pro-China, right? They don't think it's going to work effectively. It's a realism, maybe, in some sense. It's symbolically there may be some, some element. So, I think the role of U.S. is a very critical thing in our attempt. So, U.S., as I said in my initial, remark, role of U.S. in the current, government-led dominant security framework, and the role of U.S. in this middle power framework are conceptually different. But the fact that U.S. is going to continue to be important, I think is going to remain a fact of life and for many years to come. So all the more U.S. has to be in good shape. But we have sometimes, as Mike said, so it's an international issue for Europeans as well. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please.
Jesse Johnson with the Japan Times. First of all, thank you for doing this today. Thank you all for being here. I had a chance to quickly look over the report when it was released last night, I think, yesterday. So forgive me if I stumble over it, because it's also kind of complicated. But in your report, you talk about how Japan can improve the relationship with North Korea. You list a bunch of prescriptions, but I'm curious how Japan can get to these prescriptions in the first place, with considering the potential opposition from conservatives within Kishida's LDP, opposition from the U.S. to really even talking about anything, because there's no substantive talks. Denuclearization, should that be completely brushed aside, and should we just be more realistic about this? Kishida seems to be more open, especially in recent months, to pursuing diplomacy. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that issue, especially with the anniversary of the Korean War armistice coming up this week. Thank you. Oh, sorry. One more question, too. So in your report, you say that Japan should not misapply the lessons of the Ukraine war to Asia. But Prime Minister Kishida and others have repeated the mantra that Ukraine could be East Asia tomorrow. Do you believe that the invasion of Ukraine is merely being used as a convenient excuse for pushing through these kind of policy shifts like counterstrike and 2% of GDP on defense? Thanks.
Whichever of you wishes to.
Okay, well, let me start, and I'm sure Professor Soya and Dr. Ashizawa might want to chime in. About North Korea, even during the last days of the Abe administration, Prime Minister Abe had begun to talk about wanting to meet with the leader of North Korea without preconditions. and this was a major turn. Part of it was motivated by President Trump's summit diplomacy with North Korea. But it was also a realization that time was running out on the abduction issue, and the families of the abductees were clamoring for direct talks with North Korea. And so I think the constraints that existed some years ago, that just pursuing a hardline policy is the way to go, I think that is weakened. Now, of course, there are hardline conservatives in the LDP that may be against this, but I think the late Prime Minister Abe opened the door, and I think Kishida has now embraced his willingness to talk with North Korea without preconditions. And as a first step, we advocate the construction, the organization of a liaison office to investigate the fate of the abductees in North Korea. And so that would be a first step in the reaching out with North Korea. The other positive thing, and which isn't discussed very much, is President Yoon's orientation. Now, most people talk about how President Yoon is very much now on the side of the United States and Japan and is promoting trilateral cooperation. And that is indeed true. But at the same time, it's interesting that he also talked about wanting to engage North Korea without preconditions, and it's called the audacious policy. And so, as Professor Soya mentioned, Japan and South Korea being probably the strongest kind of middle power partners in Asia, and the improvement of these relations, if the two countries work together, even though there might be some concerns on Washington, I think they have the maneuverability to engage North Korea. Now, it's not going to be easy, but the current situation of just standing by is, in a sense, a terrible situation, because all we're seeing is North Korea moving step by step to having a nuclear arsenal and a missile capability to strike on the continent of the United States. And that would certainly weaken the notion of extended deterrence. So I think time is of the essence here, and Japan and South Korea should really take the leadership. I do hope that the Kishida administration will pursue this line, but unfortunately, I don't see these kinds of ideas floating around in Japanese discourse, and I hope that our report makes a contribution. In terms of misapplying the lessons of Ukraine, first of all, we acknowledge that we should never take security for granted. And that's why we see the importance of deterrence. But at the same time, while we all agree in our research group that President Putin launched an illegal, an act of aggression against Ukraine, violating international law and international norms, we also wanted to remind everyone that there was a missed opportunity after the end of the Cold War to stabilize relations with the Soviet Union, then later the Russian Federation. And even starting under President Yeltsin, the Russian leadership warned the United States about the eastward expansion of NATO, and then especially when it came to the issue of Georgia and Ukraine. These were kind of complete red lines, and European allies like France and Germany warned the United States about this. I don't want to say that this caused Putin to invade Ukraine, but it certainly created a strategic context and environment to increase the incentive for someone like Putin to launch a war of aggression. And so if you think about East Asia, I mean, I think Xi Jinping, from a straight Chinese national interest point of view, does not want to use military force against Taiwan, would want to avoid war over Taiwan. But if we create a strategic context where the Chinese leadership feels that the only way to prevent the permanent separation of Taiwan from China, there's no possibility of unification, and that the only way to have unification is through military means, then we are at a very dangerous moment. Now, I don't think we're there yet, but we should be very careful in not saying that because of Ukraine today, it's going to be East Asia next, and create the same kind of strategic environment that impedes the possibility of a peaceful approach to dealing with the Taiwan issue.
Very interesting point, if I may say so.
Just one point about the wrong lesson that many of our security experts and policymakers learned from Ukraine. That's about the phrase which they like, heaven helps those who help themselves. And so in order for Japan to get support from the international community, let alone the United States, Japan should do its homework of building up defense. Sounds okay in the ears of many, perhaps general public. But I think there is a serious problem here. What a scenario whereby, Japan would need to face Chinese military challenge, where we need assistance from international community. It's in relation to Taiwan contingency, right? There is no credible scenario whereby Japan will have to face Chinese aggression, military aggression onto Japanese national homeland. Aside from, the escalation of war starting from Taiwan, or maybe Senkaku. But we are talking about Taiwan contingency, essentially. Well, those security experts are talking about Taiwan contingency, essentially. And as Mike said, in case of Taiwan contingency, US does need Japan. And there are many simulations, coming from the US. And some of them say, without the help of Japan, US is going to lose, right? So US does need Japan. And the US want Japan to do more because they need Japan. And so that's, that way, including 2% of GNP issue. I think this way of expressing the lesson, I think it's for the purpose of just justifying what they want to do from some coming from some other internal urges. I don't know whether it's nationalism or it's the reactions against Japanese liberals. I think essentially from domestic context, not from strategic context.
Okay.
Yeah.
If there are any more questions, if not, I would like to just ask one quick question to end. How realistic, honestly, is this concept of middle power? Middle powers, I should say. The countries that have massive military hardware in the region, China, United States, and Japan to some extent, these are the real power players. So how realistic is it to believe that middle powers can actually have a substantive impact here, and which are the chief middle powers that you're thinking of? I mean, especially in Asia, in Southeast Asia, for instance. So whoever wants to comment.
I'll be just quick. I mean, the merit of middle power cooperation is not particularly in this context of balance of power. As you said correctly, we don't have that power to match either US or China. So, so we have to somehow sort of play our game somewhere in between. And maybe similar to what Europe has been doing after the end of World War II, in between Russia and the US.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, analogy is not sometimes dangerous, but yeah, if I may.
And which are, in Asia, which are the key middle powers in Asia that you think can make a difference?
So logically, as I said, Japan, South Korea,
Yeah. Okay. All right.
and Australia.
And
And
Australia.
India is by nature not as middle power, but their policies for the time being will remain, that of middle power.
Okay.
And then the ASEAN states.
And
And
of course,
yes,
ASEAN.
yes,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in any of these middle powers on their own
Yeah.
cannot deal with the great powers, and so that's why we talk about
Yes.
engaging the middle powers into creating a coalition that then can constrain.
Okay. Are you targeting the ASEAN states, for instance, in making presentations and testing the water, as it were?
Well, Dr. Ashizawa and another member of our group, Professor Watanabe, and I will be traveling to Thailand this Sunday, and we'll be presenting our ideas at a conference in Thailand.
What about Singapore and Malaysia, for instance?
One of our project members is a faculty member in Singapore.
I see.
And so, we definitely would want to get these ideas filtered through in Southeast Asia.
Ashizawa Sensei, do you want to add something quickly, very quickly on
Yeah,
that?
I know. Sorry, about India. As Professor Soya said, maybe they may not consider themselves as a middle power, but their actual diplomacy has been indeed in line with this kind of middle power diplomacy concept. And then even they collaborate with French government to promote this kind of new initiative toward the solar panel alliance. And then French also said they are the great middle power. So the concept indeed itself can be kind of interpreted as a new kind of partnership. And in order to bring a little bit more kind of the collaborative effort to bring particularly the positive the action vis-a-vis economic cooperation or security management or transnational, addressing transnational challenges.
Okay. We're right up against time, I'm afraid. Just let me clarify one housekeeping point. Sorry, I came in rather late this morning, later than usual, for which I apologise. As far as the distribution of this report is concerned, I believe you've presented a number of copies here this morning, right? But how can people generally get hold of it?
Yes, well, we've started to put it on various websites. It's already available on the George Washington University Seeger Center for Asian Studies website, and both the Japanese and English versions.
Okay. Okay, well, we're at the end of time, unfortunately. I often think with these deep dive events that we raise more questions than we're able to answer. And, we scratch the surface to some extent, but I think it's been a fascinating debate. Certainly I found it very interesting. And I hope we can get you back again on some future occasion to take it to the next stage. So please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you. That closes the official event.